Welcome to the Deep 404. News has been reported confirming the death of Gonzalo Lira. Gonzalo Lira, an independent journalist, a YouTuber, a man with dual citizenship, American citizenship and Chilean citizenship. He was critical of President Zelensky in Ukraine and was captured and detained in Ukraine. Some months ago, he allegedly escaped and perhaps was captured on the border trying to leave Ukraine. He has now, it has been confirmed by the US State Department, died in custody in Ukraine. There was in a private email to Gonzalo Lira's father, the US State Department acknowledged that it was aware of Lira's hospitalization in December. And this was after Lira Sr had informed the State Department that his son was suffering from pneumothorax, a condition of leaking and collapsing lungs, often caused by trauma to the chest. His father believes such trauma could have come from Ukrainian prison guards, is what his father believes, who Gonzalo Jr. accused of torturing him after he briefly escaped. And he posted on Twitter or X when that happened a few months ago. There's some controversy about this because of the lack of interest in his plight and in rescuing him from Ukraine, he being an American citizen. It does seem as though while the US State Department is saying all of the right things now, many people believe that they condoned his imprisonment and what was happening to him because he was critical of President Zelensky. Elon Musk had actually on Twitter had appealed to Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to explain the request, the detention of Lira, why he had been detained in Ukraine. Tucker Carlson has recently covered this topic as well. And it's a sad state of affairs where you have someone who is a journalist critical of a government and they are imprisoned and likely tortured, ultimately leading to their death. So that appears to now have been confirmed. In other news around Ukraine and interesting news around Ukraine, of course, the Lloyd Austin mystery. The Secretary of Defense for the United States, Lloyd Austin, who has not been seen of since the 22nd of December. It seems perhaps he was spotted somewhere just after that, but certainly since the 1st of January, he's not been seen. Today, there was an update from the Pentagon, and I'll just read through this update. This is from the Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder. He provided the following update on Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's health status. Secretary Austin continues to be hospitalised at Walter Reed National Military Medical Centre and remains in good condition. Now, remember, he apparently has been hospitalised due to a urinary tract infection after surgery on the 22nd, which was relating to prostate cancer. Secretary Austin was actively engaged this week in overseeing and directing the US military's participation in last night's multinational strikes against military targets in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. At the President's direction, he gave the order yesterday to US Central Command to execute the strikes and monitored the operation real-time with a full suite of secure communication capabilities. Today, Secretary Austin conducted phone calls with the House Armed Services Committee Chairman, Republican Representative Mike Rogers, Senate Armed Services Committee Ranking Member Senator Roger Wicker, and House Armed Services Committee Ranking Member, Representative Adam Smith. We do not have a specific date for Secretary Austin's release from the hospital at this time, but we'll continue to provide daily updates until then. I think this is an interesting story, given that when you go and read through what was said about his initial cancer, prostate surgery, that it was found early, treated early, successfully, the success on the surgery Then, however, that was the 22nd of February. On the 1st of January, he returned to hospital and was put into ICU for 4 days. None of this was mentioned to his superiors, to the president or the Secretary of State. They all became aware of this, it seems, around the 2nd or 3rd, 4th, somewhere around there of January. Very strange the way that it has been handled, and somewhat telling now is that articles are starting to appear calling out, as fact checking, that he is in hospital because of a urinary tract infection, and this has nothing to do with him having been in Ukraine and having been wounded in a missile strike conducted by the Russians on the 28th of December or the 3rd of January. There was a couple of big missile strikes then, which the Russians reported included as some of their targets NATO command and control centres within Ukraine. So there is a story circulating that Lloyd Austin and Marine General Eric Smith were in fact wounded, if not killed, in that strike. And this may be why we're getting this unusual story about his health, what has happened, how it's been managed, why it was hidden from his superiors, and why now we've still not seen any footage, photograph, video of him. Given that there are now in Western press articles saying this has got nothing to do with a missile strike, this is just him being ill from a urinary tract infection, which put him in ICU for 4 days and has now kept him in hospital for another week after that, with no known release date for him. Instead of dispelling those myths by simply showing a video of him in hospital, talking to his generals about the attacks on the Houthis or something like that, there's been nothing. All there has been are written reports claiming that he has spoken to other people. So very interesting. In terms of Ukraine, the UK seems to be stepping up now, with the US struggling to get through Congress funding to continue to support Ukraine. The UK is doing that. Rishi Sunak has just visited Kiev in Ukraine, met with President Zelensky there. He's promised to transfer the largest batch of drones that the UK has ever delivered to Kiev. About £200 million will be spent on the purchase and production of thousands of military drones, reconnaissance, attack and maritime. This is Sky News reporting that. Most of the drones will be produced in the United Kingdom, but the country's Defence Department will also involve foreign partners in order to significantly increase the supply of drones to Kiev. Further to this, it has been clarified that London has decided to increase the volume of military spending to Ukraine to be £2.5 billion in the next financial year, which is £200 million more than the previous 2 years. So the West, the UK, the US, still wanting to fund Ukraine at this time, wanting to keep this conflict going, or at least operating, and some level of control in there. There are multiple reports, even from John Kirby. There's a report from John Kirby today where he's spoken about the fact that Russian attacks are increasing and that funding's not coming from the US, and the Congress needs to sort that out. Clearly, the Biden administration wanting to manage the conflict in Ukraine so it appears successful as he leads up to his November election this year. If the US can't fund this, perhaps they're leaning very heavily on the UK, their partners at the moment, to say, you guys provide some funding now to cover things so that the country doesn't completely fall apart and turn into a giant disaster before we get to the election. After the election, that could happen. It could be managed. Prior to the election, that would, I imagine, hand the election to Trump or Vivek or whoever it's going to be that will run up against Biden in the upcoming election. But anyhow, the UK stepping up with £2.5 billion in the next financial year. Now, the Russian missile strikes, these are ongoing. There were very, very big ones on the 28th of December, the 3rd of January. There are reports just from a few hours ago of up to 11 Tu-95 bombers in the air, lifting off from the Olenia airfield in the north of Russia. The Russians have reportedly at least 50 of these Tu-95s in an operational state. So 10 or 11 of them in the air at the moment, likely to be launching missile strikes on areas of Ukraine. Some indications that the northern oblast around Chernihiv, Sumy, that area up there might be coming under attack, with some air defense warnings going off in those areas. Reports from a sort of pro-Ukrainian source, the Institute for the Study of War, they are reporting that the Ukraine Main Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, Deputy Chief Major General Vadim Skibitsky, has stated yesterday that Russian forces have 462,000 personnel in Ukraine. So just under, rounding it up, Swedish rounding, 500,000 personnel, Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And that this is enabling the Russian military's entire combat-capable ground forces in Ukraine to be able to conduct routine operational levels of rotations. On Alexander Mikurus's report from yesterday, he stated there that reports are that the Ukrainians believe the Russian forces are at 95-96% strength. So they're effectively at full strength because of the growing number of volunteers to join the Russian forces. The Russians seem to be having no problem with keeping their desired number of brigades fully stocked and being able to rotate them nicely. And that obviously must make an enormous difference if you are a frontline soldier coming under attack, seeing men around you being wounded and killed, with the knowledge that on a known regular schedule you're going to be rotated out for some rest, and other fresh faces will be coming in. That must just boost the morale enormously, compared to if you were in a situation where you are running low on combat soldiers, where you are struggling to get new ones to replace those that you are losing. And you're in a situation where your men at the front line are held at the front line for long periods of time without rotation, seeing the men around them dying and being wounded, and then themselves not having an idea of when they're going to leave, must be completely demoralizing. And I would suggest that this is the sort of thing which is happening more frequently on the Ukrainian side at the moment than the Russian side. Reading between the lines of this ISW, Institute for Study of War article, and they talk about in there also the Russian forces being able to replace losses and restock. What wasn't said in the article was this is very similar to Ukraine, and Ukraine now feels that Russia has reached similar levels of being able to rotate and restock its men as Ukraine. There was no mention of that. It seemed to be just the slightly depressed realization that the Russian forces are operating with regular rotations, and the indication being that the Ukrainians are not able to do that along the front line. So just going back to the notes I had before on John Kirby, in terms of support for Ukraine, he was at a press conference, and he was asked by one of the reporters there, has the well run dry in terms of support for Ukraine? And he said yes. He said the support for Ukraine has ground to a halt. Until Congress approves additional supplemental funding, then there's nothing that they can do at this stage in terms of funding to support Ukraine. So this, again, not only bad news for President Zelensky, but at this time, very detrimental to the likelihood of Ukraine being able to continue successfully as a nation. Not getting military support puts them on the defensive, but not getting financial support in large enough numbers to be able to pay for pensions, to be able to pay for the civil servants, the government starts to fall apart. Services like the fire service and the police force starts to fall apart because people aren't getting paid. The likelihood of people looking to leave the country increases as people recognise that they just aren't going to get jobs and be able to sustain themselves, and so they will look to move to become refugees and move to the West in Europe. Plus the mobilisation package, which is meant to be coming in the next few days, sounds as though it will be very broad in who will be required to join the fight to be able to try to replenish the Ukrainian numbers at the front lines. This one Ukrainian channel that I was reading yesterday, they are suggesting that this will increase the reduction in the Ukrainian population from the 15% reduction that's already seen from 43 million prior to the war down to 36 or 35 something million now. They believe that will continue in the near future to a 25% decrease in the Ukrainian population, bringing it closer to maybe 30, 32 million people remaining in the country. So, yeah, with that, and then John Kirby also, signing off in that press conference that the Russian attacks are increasing. So, while the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, recently spoke about how the Russian side of the conflict is going, he didn't say there was a Russian offensive underway. Instead, he talked about there just being sustained Russian pressure. And what I think we're seeing there are these tactical advances that are being made by Russian forces along the line as they begin to overwhelm the Ukrainian forces. I'll go to add to some of this and provide some backing for some of this. I'll go through the battlefield update. Now, this is the weekly update provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, as I say here, this is Russian Ministry of Defense numbers. So you take them with the level of skepticism that you think is warranted for them. I use them because they are consistent in that they are provided each day in a consistent format and a weekly summary is given each week. There don't appear to be wild swings in numbers and things that are unaccounted for, and you are quite often able to look at the information which is provided by the Ministry of Defence and confirm that by looking at Telegram and Twitter channels where there are geolocated video evidence of some of the pieces of equipment, for example, that the Russians are claiming have been destroyed. Now, my episode yesterday, where I talked about the Ukrainian Interior Minister who has come out and suggested that the true Ukrainian losses, killed and wounded in the conflict thus far, are 500,000 men, 500,000 killed and wounded, 30,000 a month, 1,000 a day. This is coming from a Ukrainian politician. This is not coming from the Ministry of Defence. When I read through the Russian Ministry of Defence numbers for each week, and I've done this for the last couple of months, the total number that we get to with the Russian Ministry of Defence estimates for Ukrainian killed and wounded figures comes out to be around 22,000 a month. So less than what the Ukrainian Interior Minister has come out and claimed. While he's claiming it's 1,000 a day, Ukrainians are losing. And there's some level of confirmation from this, reporting from the ABC yesterday about a senior surgeon at a hospital near Dnipro, where he talks about a 30% increase in the last few weeks and months in the number of severely wounded men they are seeing at that one hospital. That's just one hospital among many across Ukraine, where they are seeing 100 men a day with severe wounds. They're performing 100 surgeries a day, and many of them are amputations. So clearly the Ukrainian servicemen are suffering, and a lot of them are being killed and wounded. There are certainly numbers of Russians being killed and wounded also. But I have to say, and if you look at yesterday's video, you'll go through, I do some of the logic and the math as to why I believe that the number of Ukrainians killed and wounded in this conflict far outweighs the number of Russians. And I would suggest it's by an order of magnitude, quite likely, it's 10 times. So if there's 1,000 Ukrainians killed in a day across the front line, then maybe there's 100 Russians. And that's still a lot. On either side, that's a lot. But there is a vast difference, and there are many reasons for this logical reasons for this, the least of which being the overmatch that Russia has in terms of its ability to use artillery against Ukraine. And I went through yesterday how in September the Ukrainians were firing 6,000 to 7,000 shells a day, and all of this reporting that I was reading out yesterday was coming from Western sources. This wasn't Russian, this was Western. So this was the Ukrainians saying they were firing 6,000 to 7,000 shells a day in September. The Russians were firing 20,000 to 60,000 during that period of time. And then in November, the Ukrainians were firing 4,000 a month, and the Russians were continuing to fire 20,000 a month. And then just this week reporting where the Ukrainians are now firing between 1,000 and 2,000 shells. Sorry, was I saying a month? A day. These are a day. 6,000 to 7,000 shells per day, and then the Russians 20,000 to 60,000 shells per day. November, Ukrainians 4,000 shells per day, the Russians 20,000 per day, and now this week, the Ukrainians 1,000 to 2,000 shells per day, and the Russians still consistently 20,000 shells per day. So that 10 to 1 mismatch in the number of shells, combined with many other factors that I went through yesterday, leads me to believe that it's quite possible that there is a 10 to 1 difference in the number of casualties incurred between these two sides. Further, there is some quantitative research that has been done by the BBC and Media Zona group in Russia to try to determine the number of Russian deaths, soldiers killed. Those numbers, again, indicate a far lower number. Maybe it's around 40,000. They're estimating something like that. And the way that they're getting that is by using open source means, looking at obituaries, trying to find whatever means they can, looking at social media where people are reporting someone's death and talking about someone's death and collating all of those up. And they're getting somewhere, I think the high-ended estimate for them was 70,000. What was their estimate for the high end? I think their numbers were around 40,000 that they could confirm Russian soldiers killed in the conflict. Anyhow, the battlefield update. This is covering the 6th to the 12th of January. Let's read through a little bit of this. This is from the Russian Ministry of Defense. The armed forces of the Russian Federation have inflicted 23 group strikes with long-range maritime and airborne high-precision weapons, including Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, at Ukrainian military-industrial complex facilities that manufacture, upgrade and repair aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, armoured vehicles, missile launchers and artillery systems. And note that while this is happening routinely, the Russians are launching these strikes and they are getting through and doing damage, the Ukrainians are not able to reciprocate. The Ukrainians are not able to inflict similar rear echelon damage to the Russians. The Ukrainians are limited to, at this stage, somewhere around 6 to a dozen Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles fired per week, it seems. And often those attacks seem to have the bulk of those missiles intercepted. So if you are feeling like my suggestion that a 10 to 1 ratio is just complete bollocks, consider these things in here, that this damage is being done to repair facilities and manufacturing facilities. So when the Ukrainians lose pieces of artillery, lose radars, lose armoured vehicles, they're not able to repair them. They're not being provided new ones of these from the West anymore either. So they've got a dwindling supply of these, and now it's becoming tougher for them to repair and to fix them and get them back to the front line. The Russians don't have this problem. The Russians have a skilled worker shortage at the moment in their war production lines, where they've expanded their military production and repair facilities to put them on a war footing, and they have the lowest rate of unemployment they've had ever. They're 2.9% unemployment, and their biggest problem is a shortage of skilled workers to be able to expand that capacity. Different problems what Ukraine has, a flight of people with skill, and destruction of the factories that are trying to do this work. And that's just not happening in Russia, that destruction. In addition, the Ministry of Defense says, talking about these 23 group strikes with long-range missiles, in addition, The locations of the armed forces of Ukraine units, nationalist formations, and foreign mercenaries were hit. The foreign mercenaries one is the one that is important here because this is what aligns with this theory about Lloyd Austin, that he may have been in some NATO mercenary group command centre when these strikes occurred. So starting in the northern area of the main front line, the Kupiansk direction, this is where the Zapad group of forces for Russia are operating. They have repelled in this week 27 attacks launched by assault groups of the AFU. This is involving the 32nd, the 43rd, the 115th Mechanised, 57th Mechanised Infantry, the 25th Airborne and the 95th Air Assault Brigades near Sankovka, Ivanovka, Peshinoi and Berestovye in the Kharkov region. In this week, the Ukrainians have suffered losses of more than 585 troops killed or wounded in the Kupiansk direction, 14 armoured fighting vehicles, 18 motor vehicles, 11 field artillery guns, as well as one Grad MLRS vehicle. When they're mentioning field artillery guns here, I believe that this is including self-propelled ones. On the daily breakdowns, you will get from these regions like a lower level of detail, like it might be a Gwodzika self-propelled or a Polish Crab self-propelled artillery piece and an M-Star-B or a D-20 howitzer destroyed. Here it just seems to be collectively from the Kupiansk region in this week, 11 field artillery guns and one Grad MLRS vehicle. In the Krasny-Liman direction where the centre group of forces operate, reportedly here, the Ukrainians have lost up to 995 troops, nearly 1,000 troops in this area, killed and wounded. 5 armoured fighting vehicles, 25 motor vehicles, and 5 field artillery guns. In the Donetsk direction, where the Yug group of forces are fighting and providing this reporting, they've repelled 6 enemy attacks around Krasnoy, Kurdimovka, Antonovka, Bogdanovka, Kleshevka and Andriivka, or the areas around the Bakhmut or Artyomovsk region. Reportedly, the Ukrainian losses were more than 1,785 servicemen, 5 tanks, 20 armoured fighting vehicles, including 2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and 5 Kozak armoured fighting vehicles, 63 motor vehicles, as well as 14 field artillery guns. As we move down the line to the South Donetsk direction, which is where the Vostok group of forces are operating, they have in this area been fighting around Novomikhalovka, Pavlovka and Priutne in the Zaporozhye, South Donetsk region. Over this week, Ukrainian losses reportedly are 850 troops killed and wounded, 3 tanks, 11 armoured fighting vehicles, 22 motor vehicles, 15 field artillery guns, as well as 1 more Grad MLRS vehicle. In the Zaporozhye direction, as we move down there, towards the Rabotny area, Verbova area, where the fighting has been so heaviest in this area, and there are talks of perhaps a cauldron or a pocket forming for the Ukrainians where they are being corralled into an area where the Russians are able to start to get around them and encircle them. Reports are that the Ukrainians have lost 230 servicemen in the Zaporozhye region in this week. 3 tanks, 10 armoured fighting vehicles, 17 motor vehicles and 3 field artillery guns. Finally, moving down to the Kherson region, where there are continued attempts by the Ukrainians to get across the Dnieper River to establish a foothold in Krinky, which has just been devastating for those Ukrainian troops. It has been nothing but slaughter for them in that area for weeks now. There has been no advance. There has been no push out by them to capture Russian-held territory. There has been no great loss to Russians in this area reported. There have been reports from Ukrainians who have been to Krinky that it is like hell. Dealing with frostbite, dead bodies, wounded that they can't evacuate back out. The drones having night vision capability now, being able to strike them. Heavy Fab 500 bombs being landed on them in a small area. So reportedly in this area of Kherson, the armed forces of Ukraine lost up to 275 troops killed and wounded, 1 tank, 21 motor vehicles, 15 boats and 7 field artillery guns. Also in the week of fighting, The Russian aerospace forces and air defense units have shot down one Su-25, one Su-27, and one Mi-8 helicopter, 35 HIMARS and MLRS projectiles, 6 Neptune anti-ship missiles, and a number of other unmanned aerial vehicles have been shot down during the week. Also, 2 P-18 radars for detecting and tracking air targets, 10 ammunition depots, and 1 electronic warfare station. While it hasn't been included in that summary there during the week, the Ukrainians continue to lose ANTPQ counter battery radar systems as well. So these P-18 radars are different to the counter battery ones. The P-18 ones are sort of air defense radar. They have a unique feature in that they have a counter stealth ability. They use a long wavelength radar signal rather than the smaller ones used by a lot of modern radar systems, and that means that that long wavelength is actually able to detect stealth aircraft more easily than the shorter wave ones. The ANTPQs are counter battery ones, and they are used to be able to detect incoming mortars, ballistic objects, mortars, missiles, shells, and that type of thing from artillery, detect where they are coming in from so that you can then target your return fire at the originating location. They can also be turned around and used in what's called a friendly fire mode, where you can then track your own outgoing shells to determine where they land, to see how accurately you are targeting your opponents. So in summary there, in this week's summary, 57 artillery pieces and grads. Now this is down. This is almost half of what was reported from last week. So if these numbers are accurate, then what I feel we might be seeing here is that the Ukrainian artillery has reached a tipping point where they have been attrited enough where the Russians are able to replace their losses. And again, we have from Ukrainian Telegram channels reports of this from Ukrainian artilleryman saying that his team were able to destroy a number of Russian artillery pieces in an area, only to see them the next day returned, replaced with more put in the area there. So the Ukrainians, I would say, now reaching the point where they are unable to replace their lost pieces of artillery. And this is perhaps why we have seen this decline in the number reportedly destroyed this week. It may simply be that they just don't have that many out there in the field anymore capable of being used. They may not have lost all of them, but what they might have now after these missile strikes over the last few weeks is a backlog of them in the rear waiting to be repaired. So they may have a whole heap of pieces of artillery equipment that aren't destroyed, but the barrels are warped, something's happened to them, they need repair, and the Ukrainians are unable to repair them at this stage. So they're sitting there unusable, but not necessarily destroyed. Anyhow, that's my theory at the moment as to why we have seen a decrease in the number of reported pieces of artillery destroyed this week. And going along with the fact that we have had these continued over the last couple of months reports of the anti-counter battery radar units for the Ukrainians being destroyed. Now, if you lose that, you lose your ability to figure out where the Russians are firing from, and you lose the ability to confirm that you're firing back to where you think they should be. You're going to start to lose that fight, particularly if you can't replace your pieces, and the Russians can. Anyhow. And finally, so just that summary, the number of men reportedly or alleged by the Russian Ministry of Defense killed and wounded in the week of the 6th to the 12th of January 2024 is 4,720 men. And this is a consistent number, I would say, around that number over the last 8 weeks, 10 weeks or so. Sometimes it's popped up over 5,000 in the month. But that, for a week, that, as I say, that gives you, if you extrapolate that out, that gives you a rough 20,000, 22,000, something like that per month killed and wounded. And perhaps these comments from the doctor in the one hospital in Dnipro, where they're getting 100 severely wounded men a day now. The comments from the Ukrainian Interior Minister, where he says that it's a 30,000 a month total killed and wounded, which is even larger than what the Russians are reporting. Now, the Russians here, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has reported in the past that the Russians, determine these numbers by intercepted communications. The Russians intercept Ukrainian communications about their losses, and that's how they know these numbers. I don't know if that's correct, but that's how they say they estimate these. But it seems at this stage that the Russian numbers are actually lower than what the Ukrainians themselves are now admitting to being their losses. All right, so that's the Ukraine thing. I'm just going to move on to the Middle East now. So if you're not into the Middle East, time to go and get a coffee or a beer or whatever it might be. Yemen. So the US and Britain have continued airstrikes on Yemen around the capital of Sana'a. The target was allegedly the Ad Dalemi base, which was struck the day before. So some of the strikes today have been in similar areas. Strong explosions just reported of Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and are reporting at least 2 attacks in the vicinity of the international airport there. Now, military.com journalist Konstantin Toropin has noted that the strike involved the USS Eisenhower, the Philippine Sea, the USS Gravely, the Mason, in the Red Sea. 22 fixed-wing aircraft from the USS Eisenhower were involved in the strike. More than 80 Tomahawks were launched as part of the strike, and that he has noted that this is a year's worth of production of the Navy's slice of the Block 5 Tomahawks. So 80 Tomahawks reportedly fired, and that's 1 year's worth of what the US Navy gets in terms of Tomahawk production. So that's a very expensive strike on the Houthis in Yemen, and as a lot of analysts are saying, they don't expect it to have had a large impact upon the Yemenis' capability to continue doing what they're doing, which is flying out the occasional helicopter and sending out some fast speedboats to try and hijack ships. That, I think, is likely to continue. So these strikes have used up a lot of Tomahawks, but probably haven't done a great deal to degrade the Yemenis' ability to continue doing what they're doing. Now, the strikes may have been successful in targeting some ammunition dumps and things like that, and so may have reduced some of the missile capability that the Yemenis have, or the Houthis have, in Yemen. But again, they will have their supply lines. It's very likely that they will be receiving restocking of supplies from their supporters in the region. US President Biden's statement to Congress, I'll just read through some of that, of what he said about this. Biden said, "I ordered this military action in accordance with my responsibility to protect Americans at home and abroad." People are challenging that statement, given that this is far from America, and there was no self-defense, as there were no Americans immediately being targeted at this time. Yeah, of course, he's protecting the shipping in the area, but anyhow. The strikes were carried out in a way aimed at reducing the risks of escalation and avoiding civilian casualties. Now, again, the strikes carried out in a way of reducing the risk of escalation. I kind of read this the other way. I believe that this will lead to escalation, if anything, by the Houthis, not a de-escalation on their behalf. Strikes were carried out to deter and weaken the Houthi ability to launch future attacks. The Houthi group is a terrorist organisation, and we will respond to it if it continues the same behaviour. US-British strikes targeted facilities in Yemen, facilitating Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. British aircraft that were involved in this were launching from Cyprus, so that's my additional note there. The British aircraft weren't launching from the Eisenhower, they were launching from the ground in Cyprus. In some sort of response to this, the leader of Ansar Allah, Mohammed al-Buhasti, announced previously, "We focused only on maritime shipping associated with the Zionist entity. Today, American and British ships will no longer dare to cross the Red Sea." So now the Houthis, now openly stating an expansion of the conflict, not just Israeli involved shipping being targeted, but now anything that's American, British, Israeli, they will be on the table for the Houthis to go after in their asymmetric attacks here. In and around Gaza itself, strikes continuing in Gaza, strikes continuing out of Gaza, being launched by members of Hamas, strikes continuing in Lebanon. In the southern area of Lebanon, IDF reportedly continuing shelling and missile strikes on southern Lebanon today. This whole area at this stage seems to just be waiting for that one spark to really ignite things. That spark might be Hezbollah deciding to become fully engaged in this conflict and launch a major attack on northern Israel. It might be Israel launching attacks further into Lebanon, up into the Beirut region, perhaps, and inciting Hezbollah to get involved. Or it may be something to do with the Yemenis here. Perhaps they will take some action. They will have some success. There were some articles yesterday, which I mentioned cautiously yesterday, which was suggesting that the Yemenis had made some attacks on an American warship. This wasn't the fake video one, if you've seen that. This is other comments. However, there's been no confirmation of that. But that is something that is now, given this statement from Mohammed al-Buhati of Ansar Allah, that British and US ships are now fair game for the Houthis, that is something which we may well see in the future. Again, these American warships, very modern, very capable, but they still do have some limitations. They certainly have some limit on the amount of ammunition they have. And I imagine that if the Houthis are sort of smart about the way that they do this, again, they seem to be quite good at leveraging what little resources they have, that they will look to degrade the missile supplies on some of these boats, sending out smaller, cheaper drones that are dangerous, do need to be shot down, may require the use of an interceptor missile. Do that sufficiently with maybe one of these boats that gets itself far enough up the Red Sea that they can do that, pepper it until they think it may get down to the Gulf of Aden, perhaps have exhausted a certain type of interceptor, and then launch some sort of a cruise missile if they've got one that they can use. And in that way, perhaps damage a ship. Who knows? There's ongoings at the International Court of Justice where a case is being brought by South Africa against Israel for a charge of genocide. That is continuing. I don't know what will happen there. So Justin Trudeau has come out today saying, no, it's not genocide that Israel is doing. I wouldn't have expected a great deal different from Justin Trudeau. But the conflict is still ongoing. The people in Gaza are still suffering. The people in Hamas are still coming under attacks from the Israelis there. The entire region hasn't calmed down any. And we have just, I think, a few days to wait and see what happens in the Red Sea to see if we have some sort of immediate kick-off of a confrontation in that area. One last thing, just going back to Ukraine. From last week, there was the report from a Ukrainian report that British intelligence MI6 was suggesting that they had information that Russia was looking to launch a major offensive on the 15th of January. So that's just a few days away from here. Now, that may or may not happen. People have suggested that the large missile strikes that have been occurring throughout Ukraine for the last few weeks are in preparation for an offensive like that to weaken the ability for Ukraine to be able to sustain itself at the front line. These attacks haven't been at the front line. They've been in the rear, as we said, manufacturing, construction, repair, command centers and that sort of thing. So basically trying to make the Ukrainian armed forces disorganized and unable of supporting themselves at the front so that when an offensive starts with this 460,000, nearly 500,000 Russian troops, they're able to push far more easily through the Ukrainian front line, which it appears the Ukrainians have not built strong defensive positions for them to fall back to. So maybe next week, might be a week after that, a little bit longer perhaps for the ground to freeze to make it easy for heavy armoured vehicles to travel. But we may see that coming in the near future too. Okay, I hope you're enjoying these episodes. If you are, please share them with people that you think may enjoy the channel. If you haven't subscribed and you do enjoy the channel, please subscribe, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.